All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Just as an introduction to the program, this is a project of the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program. We conduct research, outreach, and field building activities regarding what wild animals are like and how humans and wild animals interact, and how we can improve our interactions with wild animals at scale. Uh, there's today's event is an interview with Brandon Keim, a journalist specializing in science, nature, and animals. We'll be discussing his latest book, Meet the Neighbors: Animal Minds and Life in a More Than Human World, which is about animal personhood, knowing animals as thinking, feeling beings, and our relationships to wild animals and to nature. His first book, The Eye of the Sandpiper, was published in 2017. He's written 3 issue-length treatments for National Geographic: Inside Animal Minds, Secrets of Animal Communication, and The Genius of Dogs. His work has appeared in publications including the New York Times, The Atlantic, Wired, and Nautilus, where he's presently a contributing editor. He lives in Bangor, Maine. We're going to have an interview and discussion for around 45 minutes, and then we'll turn over to the audience for a question and answer discussion. Thanks again so much for joining, and remember that you can put questions into the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom window next to the share screen. All right, Brandon, so thank you so much for joining us. I love the title of your book, Meet the Neighbors. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you arrived at that title?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me here, and to all of you for coming. The the so the title it kind of just popped to mind because it was catchy and I needed a catchy title. But the reason I think why especially the word neighbors was in my head in the first place, it really came out of a couple years that my ex-girlfriend and I lived in Bethesda, Maryland, and we had the good fortune of living by this little stormwater retention pond that was managed by a nature-loving landscape manager. And every morning and most evenings, I would just go and I would sit by the little inlet stream or in the pocket forest next to it. And especially by the stream, like every morning, all the neighborhood birds would come and they would bathe in the stream. And it was just a scenario that really made me appreciate that these creatures were just residents of the neighborhood too, right? I was seeing the same ones every day. This was their morning ritual, like going to the coffee shop or something. And just, yeah, that sense of neighborliness really came out of that.
Wow, that's really nice. I feel like sort of, I never quite put that language on it, despite growing up in a suburb of DC myself and
Oh,
really
right
interacting
on.
with animals quite regularly, like squirrels and birds in the backyard. And
Mhm.
no, I've always been interested in and loved animals, but I feel like I hadn't really thought of them as neighbors per se. And I really liked that framing. But I think you share a quote from the environmentalist Stewart Brand, who said, "We are as gods and might as well get good at it," which is, I think, maybe closer to the feeling I have sometimes had towards animals, which is that, like, oh, we are affecting their world
Mhm.
so much, and we have so much influence on their lives. And so that was in some ways a little bit of contrast with the
Mhm.
neighborly framing. Could you read a bit from the book where you kind of consider that perspective?
Yeah, and I will say I've become a little bit more, or actually quite a bit more sympathetic towards that impulse to sort of think of oneself as a god, because I mean that can go wrong in all sorts of ways. But just in terms of like the actual power we have, and even the actual power that individuals have over the lives of other animals, like I think that power dynamic is often true. And it's just like we're not necessarily benevolent gods, right? We're like Greek gods who are arbitrary and capricious and can do great good or horrible things just like without even thinking about it. Um, but yeah, um the reading for this, by by now, you're likely familiar with the term Anthropocene, which originated early this millennium to describe the magnitude of human influence on Earth's life and processes. Humanity has become a planetary force, regulating global nutrient cycles and changing the climate and rearranging ecosystems. This power is something to understand not only in terms of what we do, but in terms of who we are. Our values are inscribed on the planet. What and who we care about, how we see ourselves and others, our morals and our ethics, these now shape the course of life itself. And even if we prove unable to halt the ecological collapse, if our grandchildren's Earth is a radically different and less verdant place than our own, there will still be nature and animals and the imperative to live well with them. The environmentalist Stuart Brand famously said, "We are as gods and might as well get good at it." For a long time, that statement grated on me. It seemed arrogant, triumphal, uncritically accepting of human domination of Earth rather than stepping humbly back to be, as the pioneering conservationist Aldo Leopold put it, a plain member and citizen of the natural world. Yet there is a truth to Brand's words. As individuals, each of us has the power to make decisions that transform, for better or worse, the lives of other creatures. And collectively, as communities, societies, and ultimately a civilization of 8 billion human beings, our power is shaping the world. Whether or not we like it, we are indeed as gods. But we could turn the phrase a bit differently than Brand. We might as well be good neighbors.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah, I think the interesting tension there is that to say something about us being like gods, just it does sound, as you say, it's a kind of arrogant. And when interpreted as like a good thing or a praise, it's kind of awful. But I think what really resonated about it with me is this sense of like, it's horrifying actually. Like having
Mhm.
that much influence on the lives of beings you don't understand very well and don't know how the things you do will affect their lives is
Mhm.
just such an like awful in the great and terrible sense
Yeah.
obligation or responsibility, I think. And so I like the way the neighbors title I think brings that out a little, emphasizes that you have a lot of influence over these beings that are your neighbors. But you've said that the title is sometimes misinterpreted. Could you tell me more about that?
Yeah, just I think people sometimes interpret it as, that it's a book that's just about, backyard animals or animals in urban and suburban places. And those they are a big part of the book for sure because so so many animals live in those places. But it's really just about an ethos towards nature, whether it's in a backyard or a much wilder and more intact place.
Yeah, so on the theme of animals and all their different kinds, I wonder if is there been something recent or in the science or in culture that you think really prompted focusing on this
Mm.
theme now? I noticed that your previous book, The Eye of the Sandpiper, has some related themes. So I'm curious, what is there anything new that prompted to you to revisit those topics in this book?
Yeah, I think, I was already moving towards these themes in Eye of the Sandpiper, and there's a few pieces of that book. There's an essay on love among pigeons, and another about the the ethics of robot controlled or of remote controlled cockroaches and the intelligence and consciousness of insects that I think were actually, really stood the test of time um, and kind of were plotting out the course that I went on to follow. But, in the years that followed, Eye of the Sandpiper, I just really became a lot, much more steeped, or developed, I think, a more nuanced understanding of the science of animal intelligence. And there were sort of a few ideas within that. One is just the idea that that self-awareness is not a property that is reserved for a few exceptionally cognitive organisms, um, but really, you know, instead, self-awareness is just what you get when you have some sort of internal representation of the world and incoming perceptual information and the ability to compare one against the other. And so I think um, that sense of self-awareness is just being ubiquitous. And also really appreciating, how emotions are ubiquitous too. I think, um, you know, in the sort of discourse around the intelligence of animals, and this is less true now than it was, 5 or 10 years ago, but there was always such an emphasis on, the memory and pattern recognition and those sorts of things. and much less on the emotions and the felt subjective experience. And I think, the more I thought about those, just the more pressing is the wrong word, but just the more I related to all other animals, in some fundamental way. And then I think, I just also became aware that, when in popular books on animal intelligence, I kind of felt like they were often, very much, and this study said, and here's 2 pages on the methodology in the laboratory. And in a way, they could kind of almost, at the same time as they were talking about the minds of other animals, they could almost make them feel abstracted. So I wanted to get away from that and really sort of organically bring animal intelligence, out onto the landscape. And then I think in sort of the animal ethics and human animals, or really the animal ethics literature, most of it, understandably, is been focused on, animals who are used for food and in research, and of course, domestic animals, captive and companions. Uh, but it felt like there wasn't as much attention being given to nature and to wild animals. Yeah, and then on the flip side, of course, the sort of in books about nature and discourse about nature, there's always that, still that sort of very traditional tendency not to really engage with the animals who appear as fellow persons. So I was just trying to bridge those gaps.
Yeah, I look forward to talking more about the science of animal subjective experiences in the next bit. But before we go there, I'm just interested that this book ranges such and animal cognition in general ranges such a set of disciplines. It's not just there's not one like set of scientists you go to have these conversations. It's scientists and people involved in ethics and other kinds of things. Curious a little bit more about the process of writing the
Mm.
book. Like, how did you find the people who you spoke with?
Um, Everywhere. Do you remember that video game back in the day? I think it was Katamari Damacy or something like that, where like the protagonist of it is just accumulates stuff as it goes through the landscape, just like gloms onto it, so it becomes this like just like huge ball of accumulated objects. I kind of feel like that's me. You just like once your radar is up and you're sort of paying attention and looking for things, it just adheres to you like lint. Um,
Nice. That's a beautiful image.
yeah.
Maybe in particular, the sort of different conservation versus welfare worlds that you bridge throughout the book. Um, are you more or less in one of those worlds and had to reach out to the other, or have you always been in both? And then, as you had those conversations, what sort of tensions and parallels between the perspectives kind of rose up to the top for you?
I'd say my own background is more from the conservation side of things. Although I think I always had that at the same time, that sense of relating to at least certain other animals in a very, as kin. And I think lots of people in the conservation world do that. Um, and but over the years, and actually the attorney Stephen Wise was someone who um, really figured very prominently into my, in sort of opening my eyes, in the 2010s. And then there were other people in animal ethics, who I got to know along the way. But I would say so on the animal welfare side of things, and maybe just call it animal advocacy, so it's a broad umbrella that, also includes animal rights and liberation and so on. I think that of course, people in that space tend to focus on individuals, of course, and then conservation has historically, when it comes to making decisions and kind of having conversations about how things should be done, it's much more focused on populations and groups of animals. And then, on the animal advocacy side, I think that attention to individuals also brings people towards thinking about the animals we eat and thinking about animals who are used in other contexts. and that's something that, is really outside of conservation. I mean, there's, sure, there's people talk about, land sparing or the environmental impact of different diets and things like that, but it's not about individuals. And I think the divergence between those sensibilities almost plays out in a more sociological way, where you just end up with kind of different camps of people and talking about different things. And yeah, and I just think that's too bad because of course, those conservation and animal advocacy are really the two great traditions we have for people who yeah, for people who care about the non-human world. So it's important to bring them together.
Jumping a little back towards the different examples of animal cognition that impressed you or interested you in the course of writing this book, could you read us a little bit that illustrates some of the kinds of things that animals can do that people might not expect?
Yeah. Um, so we'd already uh talked a little bit about the the idea of self-awareness as just being completely ubiquitous. So I'm going to skip that and just read a little passage that is so it's set here by the stream in Bethesda. It begins, while the squirrels play in the lowering sun's long light, a pair of starlings pay a late day visit to the birdbath stream. They dip their heads and beat their wings, sending up a spray that soaks their plumage and deepens its breeding season iridescence. Starlings don't receive nearly enough credit for being beautiful. At this time of year, the nominally black feathers of breeding adults ripple with purple and emerald, while the tips of each non-breeding adult's feathers are dipped in gold. Several years ago, a British ethologist named Melissa Bateson conducted a series of experiments designed to learn about how bathing makes birds feel. She adapted so-called cognitive bias tests originally developed to study humans, particularly very young children and other people who couldn't easily articulate their feelings. These rely on the way moods shape responses to uncertainty. When we feel good, we're optimistic, seeing the proverbial glass as half full, and are more likely to take chances. When we feel bad, the opposite is true. The same holds for animals, too. Bateson made recordings of starlings crying out in alarm and played them back to the birds in her lab. Those who bathed earlier that day looked up, scanned their surroundings, and quickly returned to their meals. They were in a positive frame of mind. Those who had not been allowed to wash, however, were slow to resume eating and remained vigilant throughout. They were anxious. The possibility of being attacked seemed to loom large. The starlings in the stream, at least, should be plenty relaxed. And I just loved that bird bath example, both because it's a really clever study, but more than that, it's just something like you step out of the shower, you feel good, and to know that starlings and ostensibly other birds who bathe as well feel something like that too, and that you can even just think of that and have that in the back of your mind when you see some birds flapping in a puddle after the rain. I just really love that.
Yeah, I think the idea of animals pursuing their own interests and things that feel good is sort of emerging in the wild animal welfare space as a very reasonable hypothesis. I think people outside the sciences might not even say hypothesis, but
Yeah.
I think in the sciences we try to stay extremely strictly close to what we can show with the evidence. But as a way of interpreting how animals behave, it makes sense, right? Like I reach for the cookie jar because cookies taste good for me, not because I'm undergoing some evolved, uh,
Totally.
non-emotional calculation about the caloric benefits or something like that. So yeah, I think it really pushes towards the understanding of animal sentience as something that might involve pleasures and pains and the things that motivate us to live our lives the way we do. Um, Starlings are a great animal to mention because, as you mentioned, they're very beautiful, but they are considered invasive in the US. And so you have many birders of not all, but many birders who view them as sort of not a relevant bird and people who would like to eliminate them from the US. Um, I think that really pushes us in the direction of the invasive species management conversation. You have a section of your book that discusses donkeys as a invasive species. Could you just sort of summarize for the audience, like what you discovered and what you learned about that context?
Sure. Well, I should say I would say it's not me who discovered. It was really this then young ecologist named Eric Lundgren. Um, and uh, what Eric did is so he's just someone who really grew up. So he's a conservation biologist by training, but and earlier in his career he had really not questioned sort of any of the tensions that exist around, who we consider native or non-native and how invasiveness is defined and so on. And he just kind of went along with that. But in the course of his own work, he just sort of began to question it sometimes and wonder, whether these labels were really being applied in a truly fair and even scientific way. And he just sort of became more open-minded to the idea that, just because an animal is not native, that doesn't automatically mean that they're not productive members of an ecosystem, and also, that they don't deserve, the same sort of ethical regard or have the same moral weight as any other creature. And this kind of just turned into him. One day he lived in Arizona and he was camping along the Bill Williams River, and he was just noticing how donkeys, and so just back up a little bit here. So, wild donkeys are pretty common in the southwestern United States. And they are descended from animals who were, largely used in mining and labor, and originally, I think, brought over in the 16th or 17th century, and then really used up until the early 20th century. And you know, horses evolved in North America until very recently. Animals much like donkeys would have been a completely normal part of landscapes in southwestern North America. But they were extirpated a few thousand years ago. And so the baseline that most people work from is one in which, wild horses and wild donkeys are, you know, gone from the landscape, and the newcomers are considered non-native and invasive. And so Eric's watching these donkeys and he observes how they're digging wells for water. And he's just like, well, that's really interesting, right? Because they are creating access to water in a in an arid environment. And so he just, looked in the literature and nobody had really talked about this. And he was curious, what other animals use that water. And so he set about studying this. Um, and it was great, like he did, like I think he bought his original trail cameras through a Kickstarter campaign. This is just like, like some kid with an idea. And that just turned into really a series of wonderful papers, one of which was published in the journal Science, describing all the other creatures who use these wells and how, it's, you know, yeah. And so that insight has been slow to percolate out, and a lot of people are kind of not willing or very reluctant to see donkeys as doing anything good at all. But but yeah, it's they too are part of their ecosystems, and I think just that open-mindedness towards creatures who are considered invasive, and just a willingness to question assumptions and challenge them, and see them in their completeness, and also see them as individuals, which is very important to Eric. Yeah, I just think it's an important habit of mind to bring to conversations about invasiveness.
Yeah, before I started engaging in the wild animal welfare discipline, or as I have, I've sort of been very disappointed in how little evidence seems to govern management decisions in wildlife. I'm thinking about the fact that just this week I was reading an article about fish releases, like the practice of fish stocking in the United States, where for anyone who's not aware, we have large numbers of different kinds of species of fish that we release that are non-native that we put into various waters in the US in order for people to be able to fish them. And these are not populations that just disappear at the end of the year. Many of them are somewhat established. And if you talk to wildlife agencies about why this is okay, they say, well, these animals are not invasive because they have some very specific definition where they're not native, but they're not, creating
Mhm.
problems under some terms, so they're not invasive. And it's very unclear to me why that would apply to these fish and not to the
Mhm.
donkeys when it's not clear what meaningful ecological problems you could point to that this is causing that would not be caused by a similar native animal. Um, so yeah, I think like as I pursue wild animal welfare science as someone who's fundamentally interested in the science itself, like the intellectual value. But I also pursue it as someone who really cares about animals and wants the management of animals to be evidence-based to improve their well-being. And this chapter, I have to admit, really made me question if that's ever going to work. So, am I being too pessimistic? Is or do you think this is like that eventually science finds a way, maybe? Or
I think I think you're absolutely being too pessimistic. I think change takes time, and institutions in particular take time to change. And I think the real measurement of this will be, across decades, not just across years. But I would also say that, I think, and I fall into this habit of mine too. I think it's very easy to think about change happening in the ways that it's most easy to measure. So often that means, wildlife management policy or policy in whatever domain we're talking about. And of course, wildlife management policy is incredibly important and it touches the lives of so many animals. But that's not the only place that change happens. And I'm thinking actually of this interview I had with a wild horse advocate a while back, and you know, and a lot of what can be said about donkeys can be said about wild horses too. And I should say here, like I think sometimes people go, there's sort of like the absolute relativist position where that says, even the concept of invasive is meaningless. And really there's no such thing. And I don't subscribe to that. I think it's really something that you take on a case by case basis. And look at the full range of interactions and consequences that are happening from a species presence. And there certainly are places where wild horses and wild donkeys are overpopulated. And there's also a case to be made, obviously, that the reason they're overpopulated is because all their predators are gone. But all that being said, this isn't just to say like, wild horses and donkeys are perfect in every regard. But then you can say the same thing about native animals, of course, too, and us. So. But anyways, I had this interview with a real estate agent and wild horse advocate who has been going out of her way to try and connect buyers to connect people who are buying property in her little corner of I think Nevada. Um, and so the when parcels are up for sale sort of along the edge of, at the urban wildlands interface and along the edges of places where horses lives, she tries to put horse-friendly buyers in there, right? Like people who will want the horses there, who might even put water out for them, that sort of thing. And that sort of change, like that's not a wildlife management agency issue. That's just, people working within their communities and their own powers and institutions. And that sort of change doesn't get measured, but it happens a lot quicker, I think, and it is happening.
thank you for some pieces of optimism to share. I do think that also, if you're looking for wildlife management to have a coherent
Mhm.
philosophy, that would require, it's a, at least in the US, it's a, many agencies working at different scales and maybe different cultures within different offices.
Mhm.
Um, and and some of the criticism is toward sort of whatever kind of maybe land ethic or other kinds of philosophies that have underpinned wildlife management for a long time to the extent that there is a single philosophy or something like that. And so I think it's interesting to now kind of approach your last chapter of the book, which engages philosophical questions about wild animal suffering, where perhaps one option for a theory of what are we managing wildlife for would be to maximize animal well-being as much as possible. Um, you describe relocating tadpoles from a puddle where where they would have dehydrated, which is a sort of micro anti-suffering intervention. Could you share a passage from the book that helps illustrate the sort of viewpoints of those who have this sort of wild animal suffering focused perspective?
Yeah. Um, and so the sort of the tension with rescuing the tadpoles was, of course, the knowledge that like 99% of them were going to end up being eaten or starving to death or not living to adulthood. And then it's sort of that question of like, oh, so like what am I doing? How much good is actually coming out of this? And in the passage, the rise of an ecological ethic during the 20th century. He who has not learned to think like a mountain, wrote Aldo Leopold of a rancher who exterminated wolves from his range. Oh, shoot. I think, sorry, I'm reading from an early version of the book, or an early galley, um, and I left out the second part of that quote, and I don't remember it off the top of my head. But anyways, Aldo Leopold was that was from his famous essay in which he saw the light go out of a wolf's eyes after he shot it, and that experience really made him question the then dominant ideology towards predator management. And he was asserting that, no, actually, the wolves belong on the landscape, and the mountain knows this, and you need to think you need to think like a mountain and accept the wolves' presence and their interactions. And so that helped redeem predators. Environmental philosopher Holmes Rolston would go on to call predation a sad good, tragic but necessary. That is where most nature-minded people have settled. Predators don't act maliciously, unconsciousness comes quickly, and predation, along with disease and starvation, is an essential part of nature. One might also speculate that the scientific denial of animal intelligence offered an indirect source of comfort. One doesn't need to grieve for an automaton. But the advent of modern animal rights philosophy and the deeper scientific appreciation of animal minds that accompanied it brought renewed attention to the matter of animal suffering. To think that an animal's pains compare to our own, and that their demise is the end of a precious, singular experience of life, makes it harder to shrug off misery and death as an inevitable necessity. Certainly, we don't take such a circumspect attitude when it comes to our fellow humans or to animals we've come to love. Some philosophers have wondered if we might even do something about the suffering of wild creatures, or at the least, better understand it.
I'm happy to raise my hand up as someone who's not a philosopher who has also started to engage deeply with this question of what we might do about the suffering of wild animals, or at least do to better understand it. And I think in some ways that's the core theme of the Wild Animal Welfare Program here at NYU. But sort of as you mentioned, when I speak to other people in animal advocacy about wildlife, the focus is almost entirely on issues like the ones we were discussing earlier. Are invasive species, should they be lethally managed? Um, should wild horses be treated this way or that way? And I think this framing of suffering as being possibly ubiquitous in nature
Mhm.
really pushes towards saying, even in cases where we are not directly responsible for some particular source of suffering, do we have a neighborly, shall I say, obligation to
Mm.
support the well-being of the other animals who live around us? I wonder kind of where you came to when thinking about this issue, and how that
Mm.
fits with or against the framing of wild animals as our neighbors.
I think, it's something that strikes me about the wild animal welfare discourse, and really the wild animal suffering discourse, which is often the name given to it, is that preoccupation with suffering. And I think that's understandable. I think a lot of the people in that world are also, you know, coming out of bodies of thought where they're thinking about the suffering we inflict, especially on farmed animals and research animals. And of course, suffering is a very, you can miss a lot of things if, you know, but if you miss somebody's suffering, then you're really missing something important. So I think it's, on the one hand, it's understandable that there's such an emphasis on suffering. But honestly, like I almost feel like it gets fetishistic sometimes, and it really l doesn't take into account. It really looks past all the positive experiences in life, right? Like, and yeah, and so I think that that's just something I've come to believe. And then, but that being said, like I love the idea that, like right now, like, people manage landscapes, people manage ecological communities for biodiversity or for the benefit of certain species or for human uses as well, or to balance all of those things. Like there's so many, for resource consumption, whatever it is, like there's all these, there's sort of all these values we apply to our relations with the living world. And I think another one of those can be exactly what you said, right? Like, what about well-being? Could you imagine some like metric of animal well-being that, could stand right there with the metric of biodiversity and just be part of the conservation? And I just think that that is such an interesting concept. But for how it fits with neighborliness, there's some tension there. I think on the one hand, you if you're a good neighbor, you care about what's going on in your neighbors' lives and you pay attention to them and maybe you help them out if you need it. But on the other hand, you don't make decisions for them. You don't just go right in there and override their own agency and do whatever you think is best. Which is something that the circle back around, like as we were saying earlier, that's something gods do, and maybe we just want to be neighbors. So I don't know if there's I don't have like a perfect answer for that. It's just a tension, and I think it's something that every one of us can just think through in our own lives, in our own context.
Yeah, in terms of the preoccupation with suffering, it seems to me like some of the philosophical discourse on this has focused on that because of the many signals we have that suffering may be quite common in nature. And uh, but I think the reason I'm interested in wild animal welfare as a science is because of how little we actually know about animals' lived experience in the wild. In the quote in the reading you shared, you mentioned this assumption that prey lose consciousness quickly during predation. I suspect in many cases we have no idea whether that's true or not. It may be true much of the time, but I don't think when you're eaten by a snake it is true, for example. So I think it's quite complicated, and to have these philosophical discussions about, well, what should our obligations or relations to our wild neighbors be? Well, at the same time, people are coming with different empirical hypotheses and no data to support. So do you have any thoughts on sort of the order of operations of the philosophy versus the empirical uncertainties here? Are these things that just have to go together, I guess?
I mean, I guess I would say a couple things. One, but just on the predation issue. So like I always think about there was this like Louis C.K. routine from many years ago where he was talking about, being eaten by a tiger, right? And how and I can't remember exactly what he said, but just like the gist of it was just like, oh my God, like what a horrible thing it must be to be eaten by a tiger, and we humans have exempted ourselves from that sort of awfulness. And when I saw it, I was just like peaceful deaths are not like peaceful, painless deaths are not something humans get either, right? Like if you've ever known anybody who's died from a chronic disease or died for cancer, like our own lives end with such terrible suffering too. And honestly, like given the choice between pancreatic cancer and being eaten by a tiger, I would probably go tiger, right? But that being said, I just think on the question of evidence and the order of operations, I think I think there's room for I don't want to say I was going to say common sense, but I don't want to make it sound like people who are coming from from a much more empirical place are not using common sense too. So I don't mean it that way, but like, there's so much that is very difficult to study that we don't necessarily know that will be difficult to empiricize. But in the absence of comprehensive empirical knowledge, it's not as if we know nothing. And there are, you know, and of course we should always be humble about our conclusions and open to the idea that we're missing things and getting things wrong. Yeah, but I don't think our hands are tied in the absence of peer-reviewed data. But more data is always good. Yeah.
All right, so one more question before we hand it over to the audience, and on the theme of maybe more data is good. You write early in the book that it's time to take insights about wild
Mhm.
animals out of journals and into everyday life. And since we are here in an academic program on wild animal welfare, I think it's appropriate to ask, how would you encourage us to take our work into the real world, so to speak?
Um, so a couple things. One, I think we're living in this like really interesting interesting moment uh where there's almost I'm gonna say there's often backlash and it's like if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, like I feel like most of my answers to you right now would be sort of like policy based or like here are laws that can change, here are policies that can change. And all of that is important. But at the same time, discussions at that level um, can often just sort of get stuck in the mire and they happen really slowly. They get warped by culture war crap, like all of it. So I wouldn't dismiss those, but I would also say like there's just so many other avenues for change outside of that have to do, sometimes with institutions and institutional policies, but they can also be community norms, things that individuals just do on their own. Um, and and so I just think thinking about change in every possible context is really important, not just kind of let's pass a law. Um, and then also, I think really, so much change, probably all change is, except for the things that are sort of like within our immediate power to control, they just come down to human relations and communication. And I just think that community building is so essential and that, participating as a member of a community, and recognizing that other people have interests too, and just having conversations about these things, I think it's a softer form of change that we all need to embrace. And then lastly, like, this is just a question that I would love to ask you all because I think, the answer to it, like, it really just comes down to like every individual circumstance and what we're interested in the context of our own lives. And like, it's, everything that's in Meet the Neighbors, like the different examples that I give, these are just different ways that people have taken, this ethos about animals into their own world. And I think the opportunities are endless.
Thanks so much. All right,
Yeah.
now we're turning to the audience Q&A. So if anyone has more questions they want to ask, please put them into the chat. We have about 30 more minutes in today's event. So from Michelle, we have a question. As you may know, the Senate has approved a plan to kill hundreds of thousands of barred owls in the Pacific Northwest as they are not native and may be a threat to the native spotted owls. What are your
Mm.
thoughts about this plan?
Oh man, I think like one, it drives me, this is sort of meta level, but it really irritates me that this plan is something that was being planned for years, and it didn't really get any media attention until very late in the game. And I think journalists and also both the conservation and there's been a lot of pushback on this from the conservation community as well as the animal advocacy community. But I also think yeah, journalists and both of those communities were kind of asleep at the switch. And for like years, this was coming. Everybody could see it coming, and nobody said anything about it until it was basically done. So that just frustrates me. And beyond that, I just think yeah, and this is one of those things where owls like owls resonate with people, and people who are perfectly fine, who don't think too much about, the well-being of individual animals on their plates, or the animals they hunt, but tell them that, we're just out there shooting owls for the sake of, hundreds of thousands of owls for the sake of a few, and they feel that. And so I feel that too. And, I think that doesn't mean that, that doesn't mean that, the idea of a species, is meaningless. And of course, the people who favor this plan will say, well, what about the well-being of, of spotted owls? But yeah, I'm just not convinced it is a good thing to do, or that outcomes people are aiming for really make sense. I mean, one of the concerns that is sometimes voiced is that, well, spotted owls and barred owls, they mate with each other, they hybridize. And so now, you're losing spotted owls. And it's like, no, wait a second. Like, they're not being lost. They're just changing. And yeah, and so many of the changes in the environment that are driving the proliferation of barred owls, and the demise of spotted owls really just come down to not having large contiguous stretches of old growth forest, and, making barred owls the making them pay the price for that, I just think is unfair.
Just to step back a bit for anyone who might not be familiar, the barred owl is native to the US. It just isn't native to the Pacific Northwest. I think that's correct.
Yeah, that's
So
the other thing too, right? Like, this is not a species who was brought over from somewhere else. They're just expanding their native range. And I think there's a lot of people, I think wildness, sort of like, there was that time, especially, in the 2010s, when, wilderness kind of fell out of favor as an animating principle, I think, in large parts of the environmental world. And wildness didn't fall out of favor, but it didn't, I think, it kind of, yeah, maybe gathered a little dust. But I think wildness is such an important principle. And I think wildness is almost like, it's like an inoculation against our own, against the limits of our own knowledge, or a way, wildness is a way of, acknowledging the limits of our knowledge. And so I think one reason that so many people really dislike this plan is because, because the barred owls are moving on their own. Like, they are demonstrating their own will. They are truly being wild. And I think, for a lot of people, interfering in wildness, is something that you should only do if you're really doing it just to prevent an ecosystem from collapsing, but not necessarily just to change the species balances.
yeah, I feel very complicated about this issue, not because I'm confused about my policy recommendation. If it was up to me, I personally wouldn't pursue this course, but because I'm interested in all the complicated reasons
Mhm.
people bring to why they feel one way or the other about it. I think for me, I would be hypocritical to say that the reason I'm not okay with this is because it's been natural for the barred owls to move there, because I find natural unnatural distinctions relatively arbitrary. Humans
Mhm.
are a naturally occurring species. The things we do are in some sense natural to us. And at the same time, I at least looks inconsistent from the philosophies of some of the implementers. So I think it's a nice case if you're interested in philosophical examples for really challenging your opinions and intuitions about how we should be approaching the natural world. Um, from Ali, I woke up to images of the reconstruction at the Vale of Kashmir in Prospect Park today. This area has been one of refuge for the millions of birds migrating each
Mhm.
spring and fall, as well as a place for or meeting for the queer community since the 70s, even dating back to the 1920s. I feel a bit helpless about this right now, knowing that so much money is going towards these efforts under the guise of making it more kid friendly and walkable. Parks aren't just for people walking their dogs and kids, they should stay safe places for those who really need them. How can we work to maintain these spaces for our neighbors when there are so many forces working against them?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. And yeah, I'm sorry to hear that about that development in Prospect Park. I know Park well from when I lived in New York as well. And yeah, and it is truly you know a place that's full of life. Only some of which is human. But yeah, I think. I don't know if I have a good answer to this because I think, my God, you could ask this question about like everything decent in the world, right? Like how do we yeah, how do we protect and grow all that is good and kind and loving in the world, even when so many institutions and processes and greed is arraigned against it. And I think we just try. And I don't know enough about the the specifics of what happened in Prospect Park to sort of know, whether and how much feedback there was from the community that went into the process and sort of, what the people who were in charge of coming up with that plan and then implementing it, sort of how they felt and how they thought. But I think in an ideal world, at least there would have been an opportunity for people from the community to speak up on behalf of all of the creatures who use that place that was in conversation for management, um, and either to prevent what was going to be done from happening, or else to really guide the process to make sure that it was being done in the fairest and least damaging and maybe even the most life promoting way. Um, and then, ideally the people who were planning and implementing it would also be making those decisions themselves and trying to do things in that way and really, you know, yeah, and just really, really making a plan that was specific to the place that reflected the full range of perspectives of everybody who was being affected by it.
I also unfortunately don't know the specifics of that case, but I do think it's interesting to remember that animals use more different kinds of things than we expect. And so this is where it comes back to me with the empirical uncertainty. I was very interested to read recent studies of green roofs in New York City and the
Mm,
extent to which they are still utilized by wild animals who move through the region, even if they don't look to us like native pristine forest or old growth, or old trees or something like that. And in my experience working with reptiles, which is what I did in my PhD, it's so common that things
mm,
that we would think would be good are for them unpleasant because
mm,
their evolutionary and ecological history is different from ours, and so many of the animals are not social or things like that. And so like being with friends would be bad for them in many situations.
mhm,
And so I think to me it just speaks to, while we are trying to promote policies and directions for regulation of the world that we occupy, not making too many assumptions about what is good or bad for animals and trying our best. I agree with you definitely that we don't have, you can't wait for the empirical evidence to totally come in before you write that policy. But at the same time, as we do learn more about what animals want for themselves, I feel like my hope is that science is the tool we can use to ask them those questions.
ab- absolutely. And actually, if I could just give a really quick example that maybe will be a little bit more optimistic about the last question. So here in Bangor for the past few years, I've been a member of this municipal committee that the Penjajawak Marsh Bangor Mall Management Commission, which was set up to review development plans that occur sort of in this sensitive area that is both highly commercial and adjoins a really big and important marshland. And so the way that plays out is developers will bring their plan to this committee, we'll review it, give our comments on it. Those comments get passed along to the planning board, and then ultimately and then ultimately the city council will make a decision on whether or not to approve the plan. But, if people on the committee sort of raise concerns and raise issues, then often the developers will address these before the final approval. So one of the plans we reviewed was for a solar farm that was going to be built, or that has been built, on a big area of grasslands. Um, and so that was something I had really pushed for. Okay, if this is probably going to happen, but let's make sure we use wildlife friendly fences. Let's have native plants being planted there after when they're doing their revegetation. You know, let's have mowing schedules that, are timed to, to avoid disturbing any grassland birds and to really, try to put as much, forage and cover on the landscape that you can have. So just mow once a year, instead of every few months. And so there were so many things that could be done within the context of that development that, really made it much better for animals. And actually, like those fields really were being mowed frequently and without much thought as to all the creatures who were living there before. So in some ways that almost, had the potential to be an improvement on the existing management practice. So yeah, there's often ways in which you can try to get a lever into the machine and tilt it a bit.
Our next question is from Lori. I love your neighborly approach to helping animals and your tendency to move away from the hyper focus on alleviating suffering. What does conservation or wild animal welfare policy look like when we are respecting the agency of all animals in our community without being able to quantify how our actions reduce suffering? And can you speak to your own thoughts on how suffering or negative experiences balance or don't balance positive experiences? Are both necessary?
Hmm. Um, sort of the first part of that, like, I think, like, my gut feeling is that, conservation and wild animal welfare policies that respect the agency of all animals in the community really look a lot um, like good old-fashioned conservation, protect habitat, um, protect it from human influences that disrupt important ecological processes. Keep the water clean, don't cut it off, don't cut everything down, don't build a road through it, or if there is a road, whatever, have wildlife crossings, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think that just kind of looks like conservation. And uh and that looks a little different if we're talking about like, downtown Manhattan instead of, the White Plains or something. But yeah, the principles apply. Um and then as to how suffering or negative experience balance or don't balance the positive, I think all life has both suffering and all life has both negative and positive experiences. And, I know the response to that is like, oh, that's easy for you to say when you've lived for 49 years. You are a long-lived mammal who sort of won the lottery in this rather than, a baby cod who's gonna live for 6 hours before getting eaten or something. And so, of course, for that creature, the negative is a much larger proportion of their lives. But yeah, for me, I just feel like in the end, the positive tends to outweigh the negative, and even in very short lives, they still have value. There's human beings who are born with diseases that mean their lives will be very short, and of course, we want to cure those diseases. We will want to allow those people to live longer. But even if they only live a short time, it's not like we say their lives, were meaningless or dominated by that suffering. And I think that applies to animals too. And yeah, both, I think especially when it comes to wild animals, both are necessary. I think as humans have largely exempted ourselves from, almost completely exempted ourselves from the fact of predation. But predation really is such a, such a foundational part of ecological reality in some of kind of the thought experiments that have been run in the in the wild animal welfare space. What if we could, engineer all predators, either get rid of all predators or engineer all predators not to need to predate. And like, okay, like, would you even, like, if you took that principle and applied it not just to, big carnivores, but to every predator, like, I don't even think like you would not even have functional ecosystems. Like, I don't even know if you would have life. Like, maybe you would just have, like lichens and moss. Like, it's just like the world doesn't work that way. So yeah, both negative and positive are necessary.
Do you mind if I just challenge some of the
Oh,
things you just said for the
heck
sake
yeah.
of
Challenge away. I love that.
yeah. So I don't want to act as though I have a strong empirical
Mm,
opinion. Like my position is coming very much from a place of uncertainty. But just to look at the first part of like, would traditional conservation policy be a thing that is beneficial for wild animal welfare? I feel like that's just very hard to know
mm,
from the perspective of, like, just take disease treatment, for example.
mm,
Possibly in very healthy ecosystems, the average animal would have also
mm,
a healthier immune system, and that would have some benefit for disease. But there are many diseases that are in an evolutionary arms race with animals, and so they're going to be persistent even in a very clean, natural, wild ecosystem. And we looked at that situation and we said, we're going to try to treat our own diseases as much as we can.
mm, mm,
And it's interfering in nature to take that attitude towards wild animals. And it is violating of an animal's agency to give them a vaccine they didn't consent to. At the same time, we vaccinate people who are not humans, who are not capable
mm,
of giving verbal consent, and don't view that as a wrong. In fact, many people would say it would be wrong not to vaccinate someone who can't give verbal consent against polio or something like that.
mm,
Do
mm.
you have any thoughts on that kind of quibble
Yeah.
I'm making?
No, I think it's a great quibble, and I would say like I think those programs like what jumped to mind, there was a disease that killed off, a huge number of antelope, or I don't not antelope, I think saiga, a quadruped in Mongolia a few years ago, or the chytrid in amphibians, or the white nose syndrome in bats, and those are all horrible diseases that cause so much suffering, and people are trying to intervene in them, on the animal's behalf. And I think things like that are fantastic, right? Like, um, I guess, I guess just sort of an intellectual level, if I was going to quibble with the quibble, I would say that I would make a distinction between the sorts of examples that I just gave, where you have a disease that humans played a role in spreading or exacerbating, and really pose like an, if not an existential threat to wild animals, then a really, really, really big one. Like, I would differentiate between intervening in those sorts of situations and wanting to intervene, you know, in every instance of disease. Because I think, a certain amount of disease is part of a healthy ecological dynamic, or at least if not a healthy ecological dynamic, then it's just a different, yeah, it's a different realm. But anyways, like, but I love stuff like this, and I'm glad you brought up the disease example, because I think, yeah, there's things that don't fit traditional conservation that absolutely would be a part of this.
Going to Kim. Why does killing always seem to be the go-to answer when problems are being considered, whether it's human to
Mm.
human, human to animal, or animal to animal?
Because it's cheap and easy, or at least easy, and it gives you that feeling that you've done something.
It does seem, unfortunately, the development of lethal techniques for wildlife management is farther ahead than perhaps more peaceful ones. But there is interesting research going on here, like research into fertility control, which, if you have issues with agency, you may have issues with fertility control. But if we're already managing an animal population, you might view it as a less agency violating intervention for managing some kind of population level conflict. Um, to Michael, the book Zoopolis by Kinlicka and Donaldson provides a framework for theorizing non-human animals as citizens. Can you say more about how the various categories of citizen, pet, companion animal,
Mm.
neighbor, etc. are in tension, and how they are useful theoretical tools for maximizing the flourishing of both wild and more domesticated animals, excuse me.
Yeah. So of course, I mean, Zoopolis is, a fantastic and really landmark work. And I just think, I think those different categories, you know, so so I'm going to get the terminology wrong here, but Kim Licka and Donaldson, had really distinguished between those, so those animals who are really living in shared community with us, so of course, companion animals, animals who are used for food, any sort of captive or domestic animals, they should truly be thought of as citizens of shared communities. And then there's, those animals who are in a more liminal space, the synanthropes who thrive alongside us, all the pigeons and the raccoons and the rats, and all those other animals. And then animals who are sort of living in more truly wild places, could be thought of as citizens of their own sovereign nations. And I just think like intuitively that makes sense, and it's useful to think about animals that way, and it's especially useful to think about the full citizen animals that way, because those are animals who are, we really have moment to moment and day to day say over the course of their lives, and they should be represented in decisions that are made about them, and their interests should be accorded an importance, you know, far greater importance than they often are. And then, things can get tricky, and like, um, especially, raccoons. It's the raccoons are up and about these days up here, and they're raccoons figure prominently in Meet the Neighbors, and they're a great example of, they are in many places, these liminal synanthropes who can be difficult to live with as neighbors, and who do challenge us to um who challenge us to be compassionate even when, there's even when they're causing damage and making a mess. But yeah, that tension exists, right? Like how do you be a good neighbor when your neighbors maybe aren't always the best? But yeah, I'm rambling on a little bit here, but just to say, yeah, I think those categories are useful, and especially, the most important thing that I think Donaldson and Kim Licka did was just to popularize the idea of having the interests of animals represented in politics, in all sorts of political institutions, and I think that's a very powerful idea.
Okay, question from Matthew.
Mm.
Hi, Brandon. Wonderful talk. I'm reading
Oh,
your book
great.
now and loving it. I
Thank
wonder
you.
if you have thoughts about political representation for animals. So, very much on the same theme as the last question. So,
Yeah.
many of the decisions we're discussing are made through legislative and administrative processes that currently exclude animal interests. Some political theorists are suggesting various models for animal
Mm.
representation, e.g., an ombudsperson, a parliamentary representative, etc. Do you think this is possible scientifically, ethically, or politically?
So I think scientifically and ethically, I think it is absolutely possible. Sort of the tension resides in the politically or in the socially. And, you know, but that being said, like the example I gave earlier of being on that local commission that managed develop or that reviewed developments around the Bangor Mall. And so like in that setting, you know, it was possible to try to advocate for the animals or to represent the animals' interests in some way. And it wasn't formal, but at least there was room to do it. So like I think there's no timeline in which there are official animal representatives, like in the US Congress or even in state legislative bodies anytime soon. But there are so many other political contexts in which interests can be represented either in an ad hoc way or I think even in a more formal way. And, you know, like something I think about often is, like I think like large like institutions, so let's say a library or a bank or a company, I think it is absolutely within their power to say, oh, we are going to appoint somebody to speak on behalf of animals or to represent animals' interests, like at our board meetings or something. And there that does become more possible. Like not everybody's going to do it, but at least there wouldn't be such pushback to it. So yeah, I think there are lots of possibilities.
Just dwelling on the scientific accuracy of our ability to represent animals a little bit. I think when you talk about representing animals as species, you actually have an easier problem
Hmm.
because there's one species that is the raccoon species. I mean, setting
Hmm.
aside scientific issues of vagueness over species concepts, but there's the
Hmm.
raccoon species. You might define its interest as continuing to exist at a reasonably sized population in its current bounds, say. And that's something that we actually have studied for a very long time and understand reasonably well. And so you could imagine a scientist or a well informed individual trying to represent, okay, these are the things we think would happen for that to obtain. But when you start talking about the welfare of raccoons, there
Hmm.
are different welfare needs for adult raccoons and juvenile raccoons. And between different individual raccoons, you might have different preferences. This raccoon likes these kinds of tree wells to live in, and this raccoon likes attics to live in, or something like that.
Hmm.
And if I try to think about the least hubristic way of proceeding as a human with responsibilities towards animals, it's to assume as little as I can about what an individual animal would want and try to use the tools that I have at my disposal to understand what would this animal ask for if it was able to ask for itself. And I worry sometimes that when we start talking about political representation for animals, we get away from animals as individuals actually and reduce them to their species and don't ask enough questions about what they would actually want for themselves and assume that we know better. Do you think that's a risk, and how would you consider avoiding it?
So I think, I think that is definitely a risk, but I think the way to avoid it is really, to ground every content, like so right now we're kind of talking about this in the abstract, which makes it, I think, but if we imagine, let's say, so like there's a building in downtown Bangor that has a great big chimney, and there used to be uh chimney swifts who would roost in that every single year, and then I think the property management company that runs the place covered it over. So now they can't use it anymore. And so, like they like if you could imagine, or I think it's possible to imagine how that property management company could, let's say, have somebody whose job it is to, or whose responsibility it is to speak on behalf of the animals impacted by their interests. And that would sort of necessarily really be about individuals. And and so in that particular instance, yeah, like that individual would have advocated on behalf of the Swifts who use that chimney. And I think in that case, that's one example where like, okay, like I think we could probably be pretty confident in saying that if the Swifts could ask for themselves, they would ask it for us not to cut them off from their home. And yeah, so I think but that sort of representation though, like yeah, it's very much about individuals and the animals are in a place, and would be less about species, at least the sort of examples that I'm thinking about in my mind.
All right, our last question, if we can squeeze one in. The general public seems to lack a concept of domestic animal companion needs. Would a better understanding of beings close to us be a way forward to have compassion extended to outdoor animals and wildlife? From my perspective, the news, TV commercials, and other sources often provide inaccurate information about the needs of our pets, so changes are needed to be made in the representation.
Um, yeah, I think that is absolutely the case. And and also better understandings of the beings close to us. Yeah, like I think that very much pushes us to have more compassion to other animals as well, or to at least, yeah, to think about them. And it doesn't always work like that. Like there are people who will just be like, oh, like I love my cat, I love my dog, and like my circle of compassion just sort of ends right on the other side of them. So yeah, that does happen. But I think for so many other people, those the companion animals are, open a door into a much broader world of care.
All right, we are going to have to end it there. Thank you so much to everyone who asked questions, and thank you, Brandon, for talking to us about your book and your ideas.
Thank you so much for having me here. I've loved this conversation.